Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the grand final of the Chess Champions Tour being held in Toronto, Canada. Now, today we have a very big matchup featuring the former world chess champion, Magnus Carlsen, against Wesley So, the current defending champion from the first edition of the Chess Champions Tour. So let's jump right into the action. So today is the first of a two-day mini match between Magnus and Wesley. Just like the semifinals were, they play a set of 4 games. If you win the first set, you lose the second set. There's a third reset of 2 games followed by an Armageddon if it's tied. At any rate, in we go. So first 2 games of this match were pretty boring today. They were relatively quick draws. Neither side had a lot of chances, but in game number 3, we have Wesley with the white pieces and Magnus with black. So game starts with e4 here from Wesley. We get the move c5 from Magnus, knight to f3, and now this move a6 is played. Now Magnus has played many different variations in the Sicilian recently. He's played knight to c6, he's played e6, he's played d6, but today he decides to play a6 instead. Now a6 is an attempt to go into the classic O'Kelly variation, where after d4 takes, black can play this move e5, attacking the knight on d4. So Wesley decides here to play bishop e2 on move number 3. We get the move d6 from Magnus, d4, takes, and now the move knight c6. Now, one thing that's interesting about Wesley choosing to take this pawn on d4 with the queen is that many years back, around 2012 and 2013, Magnus was actually a player who, against this line with d6, d4, he actually played queen takes d4 and queen to e3, or queen to d2, or queen to d3 many different times, including a game against me in the Bill Chess Festival in 2012. I think it was 12 or maybe it was 13. At any rate, back to the game we go. So we get queen d4, knight c6, queen d3 played here by Wesley, and now Magnus plays the move g6, trying to fianchetto the bishop to g7. Here we get the move castles, bishop g7, and now Wesley plays this move knight c3. Now when Magnus was playing the system in the old days, usually he would play c4 here to try and build the classic Maroczy bind in the center of the board, but Wesley instead decides to play knight c3. So after knight c3, we get knight to f6. Wesley plays knight to d5 here, a move taking up some space in the center. White can go c3 or c4 down the road, and if black ever trades knights, white will have a slight positional advantage due to this backwards pawn on e7. So we get castles. Wesley goes c3 here, shutting the diagonal for the dark square bishop. We get the move b5, and now bishop g5 is played here by Wesley. After bishop g5, Magnus decides to trade the knights, and now he goes knight to e5. We get all the knights being traded off the board, and the move h4 is played. Now the computer actually gives white a fairly substantial advantage here after the move a4, trying to open up the queen side of the board and put pressure on these 2 pawns on a6 and b5 very specifically. So Wesley instead decides to play h4, and now Magnus plays the move bishop f5. We get the move queen d2 being played, and h5 is played here to stop the move g4, or potentially white from going h5 and h6 to try and set up a classy lolly checkmate on g7. So we get queen d2, h5 played by Magnus to stop g4. We get bishop to d3, queen d7 played, and now Wesley plays the move rook e1. Now on first glance, you're probably thinking, well, wait, why doesn't white just trade the bishops? If black takes with a pawn, there's bishop h6 followed by queen g5, and black is in a lot of trouble here. In fact, he's completely lost. However, black can take with the queen, and you might think, wait, free pawn on e7, white is probably much better. But after bishop takes e7, black can play bishop f4, attacking the queen on d2. Very important move here, because when the queen moves to say d1, now after rook to e8, the only square that's available for the bishop would be the g5 square, and after takes, black is in fact a little bit better here, because his pawn on d5 is potentially a little bit weak down the road. So we get the move rook e1 instead. Actually, one other point I did want to make out here is if black were to play rook e8 first, after bishop g5, white is simply up a pawn, which is why this bishop f4 move is so important here in between playing rook e8. So we get rook e1 from Wesley. Now we have rook fe8 being played by Magnus. Rook to e3 is played. We get rook c8. Now rook fe1. Very logical move here, creating the double stack, trying to put massive pressure on the pawn on e7, and also this pawn on d5 stops black from really playing e6 or e5, since the pawn could be captured. So we get the bishop trade on d3. Magnus now plays the move rook c4, and here Wesley plays this move g3. After g3, we get rook to c8, and now Wesley plays this move rook to e4. Now, one of the very difficult things in chess, or very specifically in match play situations, is that this is a situation where white really should have actually sacked the rook with rook takes e5, and after takes, if black plays the move e6 here, computer says after bishop to e3, If black were to take here on d5, let's just say rook takes d5 and queen e7, for example, now white can go bishop d4, and there are all sorts of weaknesses on this long dark square diagonal for the black king. But that being said, when you're in a match play situation, sacking a rook here for a bishop and a pawn is very, very difficult, because if you're wrong and you end up just losing the game, effectively the match should be over since you'll have black in the final game. Now, in a one-off, I think many people would probably actually play this move, including Wesley, sacrificing the rook. But in a match format like this, it's very difficult to play such a move, and Wesley instead plays this move, rook e4. Now, I do not like rook e4 here. And the reason that I don't like this move is white's big advantage in this position is he has the two rooks towering on the e file here, creating maximum pressure. And black right now is kind of defending, but if black ever were to play, let's just say king g2 and bishop f6, after takes and rook e7, white controls this open e file with the two rooks, and white is a little bit better. So in order to try and continue piling up pressure here, what you need to do is keep the heavy pieces, specifically the rooks and the queen, on the board. And when Wesley plays rook to e4, he's actually trading off one set of the rooks here, and now any attacks on the e file will be far less effective. So after rook e4, Magnus goes king g7, Wesley plays king g2. We get this move a5 being played, and already here the tide is starting to shift because white really cannot take advantage of this weak pawn on e7. There's no way to win the pawn here, and black actually intends to start pushing pawns on the queen side and using the open c file for the two rooks. So we get a3 played to stop b4. Now we have rook c5 played by Magnus. We get f4 here, and this is where things really start to go wrong. In this position, white is still probably okay after bishop to e3, takes rook c4 and queen d3 here, because black can never really play b4 without hanging the rook on c4. And if you play something like queen c7 intending to play b4, white just goes back to g5, and the pressure on the e7 pawn should be enough to stop black from breaking through on the queen side with these b4 ideas. So instead, Wesley plays f4. We get rook takes, and now bishop f6. And what we're seeing here after the trade of bishops on f6 is that white now actually has lost the weakness on e7 to attack. Meanwhile, black can try to go after this pawn on d5, and you have ideas like b4 to try and create a minority attack on the queen side. So rook d4 played by Wesley. We get rook c8, rook e4, rook b8, and now king h2. We get queen to f5, which is very important, and Wesley plays rook e3. Now Wesley already here is trying to sit and wait, but honestly, if I were playing this position, I probably would go king g1 and king g2 here rather than going to h2 for the reason that we're about to see in the game. After king to h2, queen f5 is played, Wesley plays rook to e3, queens are traded, and now black goes rook e8. Now if this white king were on g1 instead of h2 here, for example, white could put the king on f2, and black simply has no infiltration on the e file here as the king covers all three squares. But in this position with the king on h2, you cannot magically transport to f2, so black has two entry squares on e2 and e1, and white has to be extremely careful here to actually not be in serious trouble since black has the active rook. So we get rook to d2, stopping the rook e2 check, creating the kebab, and now we have the move g5 being played by Magnus. An excellent move here, because even though black is temporarily sacrificing a pawn, black now has a clear path to bring the king into the game here via the g6, f5, and e4 squares. So Wesley goes king g2, we get takes, Magnus plays rook to e3 here, a move that is designed to stop white from ever bringing the king closer to the center of the board. If white goes king f2, there's rook to h3, winning this pawn on h4. So we get this move f5 from Wesley, a move that is very difficult move to play, but understandable, because here if black has his way, black will bring this king into f5, and after king f5, rook f2, and king g4 here, black is winning. You've got a very active rook, the king is active, all of white's pawns are very weak, and the rest will be hopeless. So Wesley plays f5 here, stopping the black king from coming into the game. On the other hand, it creates a weakness in that black can try to go after both of these pawns on f5 and d5. So Magnus goes king f8, we get king to f2 being played, we have rook to e5, b4 played here by Wesley, which is a big mistake apparently, but very hard to understand why. And at this point, both players are getting low on time, so it's hard to be super critical of the moves. So we get a takes b4, which is wrong. Computer wanted Magnus to play a4, and the reason the computer wanted this move is that in all these endgames down the road, you'll notice that the queen side remains very closed here. There's no open files for the white rook. Additionally, down the road, black can try to bring the rook behind and win either of the pawns on c3 or a3 here, and for that reason, keeping this a pawn on the board is super critical. Instead, Magnus decides to trade here. We get a b4, a takes b4, rook f5, king e3, check, king f4, king e7, and now we see the reason that one of the biggest reasons that Magnus should have kept the a file closed, which is after rook d4, king d7, we get rook d1, rook e2, and now the all-important move rook to a1, and Wesley correctly understands here that he can use this open a file for his rook. So we get rook d2, rook a7, king e8, we get king f5 here. Now this is a move that I didn't absolutely love. I thought it might have made a little bit more sense to check the king all the way into the corner on g7 potentially here, rather than having the king in the center of the board. Instead, we get this move king f5 being played, rook to f2, king e4, we get f5 check. Magnus trying to use his extra f pawn here and push it down the board. We have king to e3, rook to c2 being played, king f4 takes, king takes f5, rook c4, and now the move king g5 is played. We get rook takes d4, rook to b7, an excellent move, pinning the rook to the b4 pawn. Black would love to play something like king h5 and rook d4 to win the pawn and push the b pawn, but after rook to b7 you can no longer go to the side without hanging this pawn on b5. So Magnus plays rook to b1, and here Wesley makes a huge blunder by taking this pawn on h5. Now again, on first glance here, black is up 2 pawns here, and you're worried that black is going to push the b pawn down the board. However, when you take this pawn on h5, this now gives Magnus a chance to push both the b and the f pawns down the board, whereas if white had gone king to f6 here, let's say black was b4, you can check, king d7, you can take, and after b3 white can hide the king with king to g6. After king c7, rook to, let's just say b5 for argument's sake, b2, and king takes h5. Position here is a draw. Rook is stuck on b1 because you can't move it away without hanging the pawn. You can't bring the king up because the pawn covers the square. So for that reason, after king d7 and king to h6, white will just move the king, move the pawn up the board, and the game will end in a draw. Instead, Wesley decides to take this pawn on h5, which also with limited time seems very logical, because you figure, well, now I've got an h pawn to push up the board, but this in fact is a blunder. So we get b4 being played by Magnus, and now the move king h6 is played, and here Wesley blunders, or not Wesley, sorry, Magnus blunders with the move f5. Now b3 here is not necessarily winning on the spot. It still remains very tricky after king g7, because after b2 there's this very study-like solution where you can check and hide the king behind the f pawn, and now you just intend to push the h pawn up the board. Black is, I don't know if black is actually winning in this endgame. The computer is not saying that it's winning. However, this would have been very difficult to find. Instead we got this move f5 being played, and Wesley plays the move h5, which is a serious blunder. Now here king g5 still would have drawn the game, because after this move b3, white does not take the pawn at f5. After takes and b2, your king is getting checked no matter where the king goes. There's no way to hide the king from being checked from behind on any of these 3 files. But you can go over the same theme here, where you can play h5, b2, and you hide the king behind this f pawn, so there's no check on the f file. And after f4, h6, f3, h7, the game will once again end in a draw. After this move, rook to h1 takes, king d7, let's just say rook f2 takes, and both sides have the same material on the board. Instead, Wesley plays h5. Now, of course, both players are very low on the clock, so it's hard to be critical, but this move does effectively lose the game, because now after f4, you cannot bring the king back to stop the f pawn, and now your rook can't go to f7 to stop it either. So black is pushing p, and one of these 2 wide pipos is going to end up queening at the end of the board. So we get king g5, f3, we got h6, f2 played by Magnus, not h7, sorry, because if you go h7 here, there's rook g1 check. If you slide to the f file, I queen with check. If you go to the h file, I just check your king away, then I make the queen, since the rook stops the pawn promotion. So we get rook b8, king d7, rook b7, king c8. Now Wesley tries to go h7 and queen the pawn, but Magnus plays the move rook g1 check, and here Wesley resigns for the reasons that I just mentioned a second ago. If the king goes to f6 or f5 or f4, I queen with check, so you can't queen your pawn here. And if you go to the h file, I just tickle the king with rook h1, make the queen, and win the game. So Magnus wins this very topsy-turvy 3rd game of the match. A very, very typical Magnus game, a game where he's a little bit worse. He keeps it close enough, gets slowly into the end game, builds a small advantage, and eventually he comes up with the tricks where he just outplays his opponent, finds the best moves in a rook and pawn endgame, and he wins an amazing game here in the 3rd game of the first match against Wesley. So Magnus wins this game, which means he takes a 2-1 lead, and now we go to the 4th game of the match. Magnus in a situation where if he loses the game, we have an Armageddon, but if Magnus is able to win or draw, he wins set number 1, which gives him a massive advantage going into day number 2. So we get e4 from Magnus. Wesley goes c5. We get the move knight to, not knight f3, sorry, we get c3, knight to f6, and now we get this move e5, knight e5, and knight to f3. Now, one fun fact is that I actually played an Armageddon game against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave the other day, where after d4 takes, and e6, we had this position after knight f3, knight c6, and queen to e4. And the reason I bring this up is because we get a transposition here where after we get the move knight f3, d6, and d4 takes, Magnus decides to take with the queen. We get the move e6 being played here, and now we have the move bishop c4. So Magnus trying to play very much like Hikaru would. Now, I will say that while I think this is playable for white, I think that in a situation where you only need to draw, it's a little bit unstable. And the reason I say that is because sometime back, actually from the other move order, I had this position where after e6, knight f3, knight c6, and queen e4, my opponent Alexei Serrana played this move d6, and I did get into some trouble. So after that experience, I kind of have realized this position isn't so easy to play. And in this game, we end up with a very similar situation where black has the pawns on d6 and e6 as well. So Wesley goes bishop e7. We get to move castles. Now, if white were to try and grab a free, what looks like a free pawn with takes, black can just take the pawn on e5. Now you can't recapture it because you lose the queen and do a Botez gambit. If you trade the queens, suddenly the pawn on e5 is guarded, and black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But black has the 2 Bs here in an endgame, and black is very much for choice. So we get this move castles being played here by Magnus. We get the move castles, and now we have e takes d6. After e takes d6, we get queen takes d6 here from Wesley, and we have the move rook e1, and now the move rook to d8. Now both sides have developed pretty routinely, but there's one advantage that black has here. Black has this open d file, but also black can develop a little bit more quickly than white due to the fact that black really only has the bishop and the rook undeveloped, whereas white has the rook, the knight, and the bishop on their starting squares. So we get the move knight bd2. Wesley plays b6. We get queen to e2, and now the move knight to f4. Now, those of you guys who watched my videos in the past, there was a very famous saying from the former world chess champion Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest players of all time, and he said that a knight on f5 or f4, if it's unopposed, is worth at least a pawn. And for those of you guys who watch my Botez Gambit speedruns, of course, I've made the meme joke that a knight on f4, f5 is worth at least a queen, but in reality, it's only worth 1 pawn. But that being said, if it's worth at least a pawn, so if you were to take this pawn, let's just say white were to even win this pawn here, if you get some position like this where white has an extra pawn on the board but black gets a knight, this is considered enough compensation or counterplay for the pawn that you've given up. So we get queen to f1 being played here. Wesley goes queen c7. We have knight to b3, bishop to f6, and now Magnus goes bishop e3. Here Wesley plays a6. We get the move rook d1, and now the move bishop b7. Now it's very important to note that in a situation where you need to win the game, it's very important you keep pieces on the board. And even though the computer likes bishop b7 here, white can trade the bishop for the knight and go bishop a6, and after takes, black only has a bishop and a knight and rooks on the board alongside the queen, and so with one less piece on the board, the drawing chance for white become much higher, which is why Wesley played the move a6 to stop white from trading the light square bishops. So we get rook a d1. We got bishop b7. Magnus trades the rooks off the board. Black would love to take with the rook, but then you hang the pawn on a6. So we get bishop d8, we get rook to d1, bishop to e7, and now Magnus decides to trade the bishop for the knight. Now it's an even trade that doesn't really change a whole lot in general terms, but at the higher levels of chess, generally these positions where one side has 2 Bs and white does not have 2 Bs, it tends to favor the 2 Bs if there's no immediate counterplay or there's no major outpost for the opponent. So for example, if we could get some position, I'm just kind of making some random moves here to try and set it up. If white were able to get some position, like I'm just going to set this up like this, for example, where white has an outpost for the knight on d5, for example, sometimes the knight and bishop are better than the bishop pair. But when we look at this position here after queen f4, there's the square on d4, which is an outpost, but it doesn't really do a whole lot here because black can put the bishop on c5 or the bishop on f6 to contest this outpost. And so the fact that you don't really have a strong outpost and the center is very closed here means that in the long term, the 2 Bs here on b7 and e7 should give black decent chances to try and win. So we get the move queen e2 from Magnus. Wesley goes b5 here. We got bishop d3. We get rook to d8. And now this move g3 is played. And here Wesley goes queen g4. Now this is a move that I really do not like here because if you look at the time situation, Wesley is up almost 2 full minutes. It's about 1:45 here, and in this situation you'd love to keep the queens on the board, keep the 2 Bs in play, and try to just keep the game going, try to slowly build that advantage, all the while putting pressure on your opponent's clock. Because when you go queen g4 here, now Magnus can play knight f4, and even though Magnus is down 2 minutes on the clock, what happens here is we are going into an endgame without queens on the board. And in such situations, in the endgame, your opponent generally does not have a lot of options. There are not a whole lot of decisions they have to make. You generally look at 1 to 2 moves, very basic themes, and for that reason, even though White's down a lot of time, there aren't many options, so White can play all these moves very quickly. So Wesley trades the queens, he trades the knights on d4 and goes bishop c5, but now Magnus plays king f1, we get g6, king to e1, we get e5, and now the move knight b3. Wesley trades the rooks and goes bishop b6. But again, with such limited material on the board here and no real weaknesses for White, it's very hard for Black to create a serious advantage. So we get knight to d2. Wesley goes bishop c6, an important move here because what White would love to do is play a4 and slowly trade off all these queenside pawns. So we get bishop to c6, which stops White from playing a4. Magnus goes bishop f3. Of course, you do not trade the 2 Bs. Black wants to keep the 2 Bs from distance, use the double sniper combo, and try to attack the White pawns. So we get bishop d5, king f8, we get b4, king to e7, and now Magnus plays this move c4. Now at this point, the position is very, very complicated here because Wesley does not have a lot of time, but he has to make a tough decision. Does he trade the pawns? Does he play a5? Does he go bishop d4, or does he play bishop e6? Now, with only 34 seconds on the clock, it's very easy to be critical of Wesley and the move that he played here, but I don't know how easy it is to find the best move, which would have been this move bishop e6. Now, the reason this move is so difficult to play is it runs counterintuitive to everything that Wesley has been building up for throughout the game. Throughout the game, the one advantage Wesley has had is the 2 Bs, or the 2 bishops. Having this combination of bishops is what Wesley has been playing for from the very start, and when you don't have a lot of time, it's very hard to suddenly shift the theme and go for something which throws away the one advantage you've had. Now, bishop e6 is the best move. The reason this is the best move is because after takes and c5 here, Black can play bishop to d8 followed by king to d5, and you'll notice that here in this position after f3 and let's just say bishop g5, White cannot push the pawns on the queen side. They are also fixed, most importantly, on the same color as the bishop, and Black has ideas like e4 down the road to try and infiltrate with the king. Now, is this winning? No, it probably is not winning, but Black should have some chances. Whereas in the game, Wesley chooses to play something different with this move a5 here. Now, this is simply a bad move. I also think bishop d4 was reasonable to play here because after king e2, you can maybe go bishop c3. Again, the computer wants to move bishop e6. I think with limited time, not a realistic move that would be played, but there is always a lot of merit because if we think about this position, this pawn on b4 is always fixed on the same color as this dark square bishop here on d4. At any rate, Wesley instead decides to play this move a5, which is a big mistake because now Magnus can take on b5, and if Black were to take on b4, for example, there's knight c4 attacking the bishop. Let's say you go bishop to c7. Now suddenly White is pushing this b pawn up the board. You've got this great wooden shield in the center with the bishop on d5. You can't contest the bishop, try to make it move because the knight covers this critical square in front of it, and Black, if anything, is actually a little bit worse. So Wesley plays bishop takes b5, but now Magnus plays this great move knight c4, forking the pawns and the bishop at the same time, and Wesley has no choice but to trade this light square bishop. If Wesley were to move the bishop, White will just take this pawn on a5, and again, White has an extra pawn here. He's not winning or anything, but inevitably Black is going to have to go into this classic opposite color bishop endgame, which will be a draw. Wesley decides immediately to take the knight on c4, takes and take the pawn on b4. Now, Black does have one extra pawn. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. So Black has an extra pawn, but the bishops are on the opposing colors. White's bishop is on the light squares, Black's bishop is on the dark squares, and opposite color bishop endgames are almost always theoretically drawn. There are many cases where one side even has 2 extra pawns and it's still a draw, like my game against Noterbek Abdusatorov earlier in the event, but just in general here with only 1 extra pawn, there are no chances for Black to win, and the game concludes pretty soon. We get g4, e4, king e2, f5. Magnus trades the pawns, goes f3, we get e3, plays f4 here, we get h6, bishop to d3, king to e6, h3, king f6, king f3, and now we get a little bit of a repetition here. Players move their pieces back and forth, and the game ends in a draw, simply because this bishop cannot target any of these pawns on the light squares. Can't push the b pawn, can't push the e pawn without either pawn being captured. You can't really move your king either here. Your bishop's tied to the pawn, can't move the pawns. King gets too far away here, for example. You say you go king d5, I just take the pawn on f5 here, and after king d4, king e2, even this endgame, for example, is simply a draw here, where white is able to just sit and wait with the bishop on f7 or g6 guarding the two pawns. King blockades the e pawn, and black can't do anything. So for that reason, the game ends in a draw here after the move bishop to b6, and Magnus Carlsen wins the first set, or the first mini match between himself and Wesley, so in the grand final of the Champions Chess Tour in Toronto, Canada. So Magnus wins by the slimmest of margins. He's able to win the one game in the middle. Wesley is not able to come back in game 4. He's not able to win any games, so Magnus wins the first match. This means it's going to be a very big uphill battle tomorrow for Wesley. Wesley is going to need to win the second mini match of 4 games and then come back in a reset and beat Magnus again in the 2-game match. Very, very difficult, but if Wesley is looking for some optimistic hope, he did do exactly that in the semifinals against Norbek Abdustorp. He lost the first match. He won the second match. The 2-game reset was tied, and then he won the Armageddon with white. So if anybody can come back, it is going to be the defending Champions Chess Tour winner, Wesley. But we will find out tomorrow. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. As you'll probably notice, unlike the previous one, I'm back to my regular room, my regular setup. I replaced the motherboard on my computer, so we're all good to go. Make sure to smash that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I will be back very soon with some more great videos from the Champions Chess Tour in Toronto, Canada. See you guys. Bye.